Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome to the 2024 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm Dean of the Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center, and a professor here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And we're very pleased to welcome you to our presentation today. Each of our talks in the summer is worth 1 CLE credit in Vermont. So if you are a lawyer seeking to claim that CLE credit, all you need to do is keep track of which talks you attend for your own records. At the end of our talk today, we'll have time for Q&A. And if you're watching on the VLGS YouTube or Facebook pages, you can enter your questions in the chat or comment space. And you can do that at any time during the talk. And we'll get through as many as we can in the last 15 minutes or so of our hour together. So to introduce our speaker, today we are very pleased to welcome Christine Rowe. Christine joins us this summer at VLGS as one of our Animal Law Media Fellows. Christine worked for environmental and international development organizations before becoming a freelance journalist. And currently she's writing for the BBC, The Guardian, Forbes, and Nature. She's especially interested in the interconnections among human, animal, and environmental welfare. And today her talk is titled, Do Animals Get Bored? Does it matter? Please join me in welcoming Christine Rowe.
Thanks so much, Jenny, for the introduction. And thank you to everybody that I've met at VLGS this past week, especially to Laura Ireland, Delcy Winders, and Meg York. It's been a really thought-provoking week. Okay, I am just going to call up my slides, if you bear with me for one moment. Okay. So this is a topic that I haven't written about, but I might do so in the future. So I would really love to hear other people's thoughts about this. And that could be examples from law, naturally, or from bioethics, biology, say. It could also be kind of off-the-wall tidbits from other fields completely, like linguistics, for example. So something that I've learned from talking to a lot of people about boredom recently is that in a lot of languages, like in a lot of Asian languages, for example, there's not necessarily a grammatical distinction between something that is bored and something that is boring. And I mean, those nuances can probably be expressed in context, but on the face of it, there's no direct separation between something that experiences boredom and something that provokes boredom. Okay, so moving on to proper meat of this talk, so to speak. The title of this talk is, Do Animals Get Bored and Does It Matter? So a lot of people hate this kind of title, which is phrased as a question. And actually, I have doubled down on the questions here. There's even this tongue-in-cheek principle called Betteridge's Law of Headlines, which holds that if a headline ends in a question mark, the answer is bound to be no. So it's kind of a cheap headline. Well, that doesn't actually apply here. Do animals, non-human animals, get bored? Well, given how vast the animal kingdom is, surely at least some do. And does it even matter? Well, let's discuss. So what even is boredom? In humans, where, of course, the bulk of boredom research has been done, and there is a surprising amount of boredom research, let me tell you. So it's thought of as an emotion where someone is not sufficiently stimulated, where someone feels that they're in a meaningless situation, and all of that makes them eager for a change. And a lot of people across different cultures have described the sensation of time dragging during boredom, and that's incredibly relatable. I mean, let's say you're doing this really monotonous task that doesn't feel very satisfying. I don't know, data entry, say, although probably some people love doing data entry. But let's just say you're doing that and it's 4 o'clock and you go back to your task and you're trying to do as much work as possible, but it's just so tedious. And you check the clock again because you're sure that so much time has passed. Maybe now it's time to go home. And actually just now it's 4:02. I mean, that's a very common sensation. So to turn pretty serious for a minute, one extreme version of boredom comes in solitary confinement. A former UN rapporteur on torture has described prolonged solitary confinement as possibly amounting to torture. Obviously, there are a lot of problems with solitary and with incarceration more generally, and I'm not by any means suggesting that boredom is the worst of these. But boredom is part, maybe a small part, of why this is such a uniquely brutal form of punishment. People held in solitary confinement have been known to harm themselves physically just to feel something different. And of course, there are other factors in self-harm in that situation, but boredom is a factor. So on a much less serious level, this also recalls psychology experiments where a surprising number of participants will choose to give themselves electric shocks just to have something to do rather than sitting and doing nothing. So that's self-harm. And there are other health impacts of monotony as well. Some of us eat when we're not hungry just to have something to do when we're bored. Some of us use controlled substances. There are links between boredom and depression and other mental health issues. And psychology experiments also suggest that boredom is associated with aggression. So to take a historical sweep here a second, discussions of boredom have often been bound up in the rise of repetitive industrial labor, typically factory work. And today, some organizational psychologists are worried about boredom at work because of implications for reduced productivity. So this idea of maximizing output and profitability, possibly at the expense of well-being, is tied up with boredom. But I should say that it isn't all bad. So boredom has, of course, traditionally been viewed as something negative, but there is a changing tide in thinking about this. I mean, for some people, boredom catalyzes peace or creativity or play, and all of those things are worthwhile in their own right, of course. But in the main, if it's in their power to do so, people will generally avoid long stretches of boredom. And as I've said, boredom can lead to self-harm, to excess eating, to aggression. In a larger view, it's linked to repetitive tasks and unequal economic systems that want to maximize labor output. And I suspect you know where I'm going with all of this, but we'll come back to these things later. Okay, non-human animals. And this is an example of just how difficult it is to determine what boredom might look like outside of humans. So you might have heard about these attacks, these so-called attacks in the last few years, where orcas off the coast of Morocco, Portugal, and Spain have been bumping the rudders of boats. And in some cases, this has even led to the sinking of the boats. Biologists have found this a bit puzzling. And a narrative that's kind of captured public imagination is that these were deliberate attacks by orcas taking vengeance on humans. And that's a great story, of course. But it's not the full story. It's kind of a fanciful story. And the latest thinking is that it's not an accurate story. So the International Whaling Commission recently stated that these orcas, to the best of their knowledge, are just playing and they don't intend any aggression. A commission report states, and this is the quote on the slide, killer whales are known to play with other objects or animals in their environment to the point of damaging them. In the southern resident killer whale population of Washington, USA, which feed on salmon, individuals will play with harbor porpoises to the point of killing them, which may be a similar escalation of an initially less harmful interaction. So this behavior seems on that spectrum. Okay, well, that example talks about killing porpoises. The International Whaling Commission is reiterating that these latest orca incidents are not violent, they're not intended in aggressive ways. And the ones who are generally engaging in them, they are juvenile males. They appear to be using the rudders as toys. Just like in humans, it's the juveniles of this species that tend to be curious. And of course, there are going to be personality distinctions there, like certain ones are going to be more open to new experiences. But there is that curiosity in juveniles generally, and juveniles also tend to have more free time. And these orcas were apparently copying each other's behavior in what biologists refer to as a fad. Another short-lived fad, this one spreading among orcas in the Northeast Pacific in the 80s, was to carry dead salmon on their heads. Yeah, as you do. So it may be that what sparked this latest fad of rudder bumping in the Iberian Peninsula is the abundance of bluefin tuna in those waters, which is one of the consequences of climate change there. So the orcas just don't need to spend as much time searching for food. And some of them, with this new leisure time, may just be bored. But there's still not certainty around that behavior. But in this talk, I'm going to focus on domestic and captive animals, because as difficult as it is to consider experiences of monotony in confined animals, it's even harder to do that with wild animals. And plus, humans have, I think, particular responsibilities to the animals that we're keeping captive. Although, of course, we also have broader responsibilities to animals whose lives we're drastically affecting through things like habitat loss and human-induced climate change. Okay, so what do people think about boredom in animals? There seems to be a hierarchy of species that can experience boredom, at least according to what people commonly believe. And that correlates to perceptions of varying animal intelligence, but also, unsurprisingly, to animals' different status as pets, say, rather than food. A study from the UK and Ireland asked people if dogs can experience boredom, and 79% of participants said yes. What about cows? The number dropped to 63%, and it was even lower among people who don't work in agriculture and don't study it. In a different study, 93% of surveyed ferret owners reported believing that ferrets could experience boredom, and those people gave their ferrets more types of what's called environmental enrichment, in that case, toys and tunnels. So the limited research on perceived animal boredom suggests that there could be a link between how people perceive animal boredom and how they actually treat animals. And it may be the case as well that people who spend more time around animals are more likely to believe that animals can be bored, although that's really context dependent. So that is about how humans witness and respond to boredom in animals, but there are limits to that perception. One is just how to interpret what we're seeing. There's a risk here, of course, of anthropomorphizing animals, of projecting human values onto them. The philosopher of animal consciousness, Jonathan Burt, suggests that while it's fairly straightforward to see animal pain as a problem, at least in certain species, and thus reducing that pain is a pretty clear animal welfare goal, it's just not such a straight line with animal boredom. And the ways that animal engagement might be assessed are really limited at the moment. So he gives the example of a study that was measuring the heart rate of cows when they had a puzzle. And the puzzle in this case wasn't a jigsaw puzzle. It was basically, they had to work out which button to press, which would lead to a gate opening and would lead them to food. So the cows, the first time they discovered the key button that would lead them to food, they had higher heart rates. And the researchers in this case thought, well, that's a sign that they are cognitively stimulated. That's a positive thing. But of course, heart rate, I mean, that could be an indication of all sorts of other things, of stress, of adrenaline, of anxiety. So I'm going to talk later about various ways to cognitively engage animals. But with all of that, there's this really big disclaimer that research on this remains limited. But there does seem to be some evidence of developmental effects of boredom on animals, and those aren't immediately tangible necessarily. So one animal boredom paper states, and this is the quote here: "We know from captive animals without sensory or cognitive stimulation to an extreme that neural pathways can fail to develop, and those already present can weaken. The brains of animals in barren environments even become physically smaller." And we also know that play helps to develop animals' brains. So those young orcas that I talked about earlier may be getting this enduring brain boost from ramming boats. So this is a bit thorny and provocative, but on the captive animal side, I mean, there could be an argument that it's not necessarily useful for an animal born into captivity to develop fully in a cognitive sense, because it's destined for a short life. And that's a difficult concept, but just one counter argument for animals used in research, say, is that dulling their brain development could potentially limit their scientific usefulness. So that's a very kind of cold way of viewing things. And we will turn to kind of the more emotional elements later. So when it comes to physical indicators, what does boredom even look like in different species? Again, it's hard to know. So it might be inactivity taken to an extreme, like the captive orcas that have been observed floating on the surface of the water or at the bottom of a tank, almost catatonic for long stretches. But in humans and in other animals, inactivity doesn't necessarily mean boredom. And from a research perspective, it's really hard to isolate boredom from all of the other stressors of confinement. That ferret paper that I mentioned earlier contains this amazingly understated phrase: "It is possible that neither yawning nor resting with eyes open are useful indicators of boredom in ferrets. And that's why you're looking at an image of a yawning ferret, which, I mean, is adorable, but also could be a sign of boredom. Who knows? But these are a few categories of behavior that have been observed in animals as potential indications of boredom. And these include aggression or self-harm, repetitive behavior, unnatural behavior, disturbed sleep, and disturbed eating. And there are overlaps among these behavior categories. So to start with aggression, let's say a lab rat. A lab rat might do everything that is possible to do in its cage. It might sniff the bars, it might try to dig around to the extent that that's possible. And when it runs out of things to do, it might bite another rat. A pig being fattened might stare out into space, stand still for a while, and then abruptly chew another pig's tail off. And this here is an image of a pig with a bitten tail, although I've increased the transparency quite a lot so that it's not a graphic image. So of course, these kinds of aggression are harmful to the animals being attacked. And they're also, I mean, to put it into stark economic terms, just bad for business. People whose livelihoods involve animals generally don't want those animals to be named when that's not part of the plan. Sometimes the plan does actually respond to this, like when farmers preemptively dock pigs' tails or cut pigs' tails off to avoid the problem of stressed, bored pigs biting each other's tails, which can lead to other health and issues down the road. So pig docking is a very controversial practice when it comes to the tails. It is illegal to do it routinely in much of Europe, but it still happens. So some agricultural experts argue that one way to reduce the problem in the first place is by adding so-called enrichment material to pigs' barns. A couple of months ago, I spoke with this young Dutch farmer named Thijs Holtprile. He's a fourth-generation farmer who has over 2,500 fattening pigs in a few barns. Now, livestock farming in the Netherlands has gotten incredibly politicized over the last few years in what's popularly referred to as the nitrogen crisis. So it's caused mainly by farmed animal waste in a very small country that has a lot of animals, a lot of livestock. And as Thijs said, the manure is almost coming out of the barns because of so much of it. There are a lot of other reasons that farmed animals in the Netherlands are part of an environmental crisis, but the nitrogen seems to be kind of the public face of it at the moment. So Thijs, this farmer, he's trying to chart a middle course. His type of farming is intensive, but it's not super intensive. He doesn't want the pigs to be miserable, but he said that he can't afford to cut down on the number of pigs that he has. And he said that there's not enough certainty about consumer demand to be able to go organic or very high welfare. So he's opted for something called the cruel concept, which gives pigs a bit more space and also adds things like sawdust and straw to the barns. And this seems like quite a minor thing, but actually he thought that this allows the pigs to express some of their natural behaviors of rooting around and, just gives pigs something to do. Pigs are famously curious animals. So in the US, the organic livestock and poultry standards, which just went into effect earlier this year, they go further than this, actually. They also require organic producers to provide rooting materials for pigs, but they also have requirements like animals generally needing access to the outdoors year-round. And this is positive. I mean, it hasn't always been the case that somebody buying organic meat could be sure that that meat came from an animal that was raised in decent conditions. So this is a big improvement, this rule. Although for a lot of chickens, the rule isn't going to kick in for another 5 years. And of course, I mean, there's the caveat that cruel and organic, and that's the cruel concept, not cruel as in the adjective. So these kinds of styles of farming, they, only apply to a very small number of animals. So there are other specific welfare schemes for farmed animals that make some enrichment claims. There's a UK supermarket chain that talks about additional stimuli for chickens, which it describes as extra enrichment bales, pecking objects, and platforms for perching. So I've been using this term enrichment material in scare quotes because this blandly euphemistic term, enrichment, I mean, it's not terribly satisfying. So basically, as many of you likely know, it essentially means stimulation. Some animal welfare researchers talk about reduction of impoverishment rather than enrichment, because that seems to more accurately reflect the conditions of many confined animals. So making the situation slightly less bad. I mean, these chickens and pigs aren't, suddenly doing watercolors, but they've got something. And one point of that something is to reduce aggression that's a result of stress and tedium, as I said. There are other expressions of that aggression. Sometimes it's directed against oneself. Farmed mink, for instance, they've been shown to bite their own tails. And moving beyond all the tail examples, African gray parrots often pluck out their own feathers due to boredom. And it's common for captive orcas to damage their teeth from grating them over and over. That kind of repetitive, violent behavior, it's a sign of monotony and distress in a lot of species. So there are examples of that kind of aggression and self-harm in captive non-human primates as well. This is partly about space, and absolutely, a certain minimum amount of space is a minimum requirement for well-being, for some well-being, I should say. But it's not just about space. Primate studies suggest that after a certain point, it's not just the amount of space, but the complexity of the environment. That's what reduces aggression, listlessness, and abnormal behavior. So environmental complexity could mean vertical structures like the ones you've seen here, or so vertical structures in addition to horizontal space. So for chimps, that could be playgrounds. For marmosets, that could be trees for climbing. And it often does mean having enough outdoor space. So that's environmental complexity. There's social complexity as well, which would mean having other animals around, although care would be needed to ensure compatibility, appropriateness, avoiding overcrowding, and disease control. So in the US, the Animal Welfare Act has a requirement of social grouping and environmental enrichment, but that's only for primates. And primates in research facilities can be exempted. That's just one of the many, many exemptions and carve-outs in the Animal Welfare Act that means that this federal law, the main animal welfare law in the US, doesn't actually apply to the vast majority of animals in the country. The new organic rule that I mentioned earlier, it does require group housing for pigs, with some exceptions. So social grouping would be beneficial for other types of animals as well. European starlings are a bird species often used in lab research, and they are often housed by themselves. This leads to a lot of unusual behaviors. One is, interestingly enough, it's somersaulting, actually flipping backwards in the air. So this happens apparently because the birds are trying to escape a lot over and over, and they're failing. And that attempt to escape, repeated, becomes this repetitive kind of compulsive behavior called a stereotypy. And being kept in isolation is a risk factor for developing these stereotypies. And the presence of humans is not enough to overcome that isolation. An example of a stereotypy in stabled horses is box walking, which is pacing around obsessively, basically unable to stop. And that's linked, of course, to limited space and opportunities for exercise, but it's also related to a lack of social contact. It's been suggested that lowering stable walls and having other horses nearby can help to address the frustration and the boredom that lead to box walking. Delcy Winders, who leads the Animal Law and Policy Institute here, has talked about how these stereotypies can persist once an animal leaves a barren environment and goes to a shelter, for instance, because those behaviors become just so ingrained. Delcy's also given a hot topic talk here where she's talked about how cows have distinct personalities, of course, but generally they're pretty social. So for a calf, being kept alone, for instance, would add to the many challenges of being separated from its mother right after birth. In the European Union, a veal calf can be kept in a pen alone for 8 weeks, although that's contrary to the recommendations of the EU's Food and Safety Authority. So for at least some species, having things to do and others to engage with reduces the tendency to lash out and to self-harm. Another unhealthy behavior is disturbed sleep. And this is another one that I think makes intuitive sense. If you don't do anything that engages you all day, you might be spending a lot of time still. But that's not necessarily restful. It's not necessarily conducive to falling asleep at a reasonable time. And when it comes to actually sleeping, some bored animals show less sleep or less deep sleep. Another health effect of tedium has to do with food, undereating or overeating. And of course, it's incredibly common in humans to use snacks as a way to break up a monotonous day. And other species actually do that as well. So captive mink, rats, if they've been given the same diet day in and day out, they've been known to choose foods that they like less, even foods that have made them sick before, just because it's different. Food is generally an interesting area to talk about animal boredom. So the image here shows a product explicitly marketed as reducing the boredom of stabled horses. It's basically a ball that swings around in all directions with food inside, and the swinging motion makes it hard for the horses to get at the food inside. In general, one reason that captive animals are often unoccupied compared to their wild counterparts is that they just don't have to spend time looking for food. And you could say that that's a good thing. Well, I would say more precisely, it's a controlled thing. So humans can ensure that animal food is nutritious or diverse, and it reduces the likelihood that an animal will get injured or killed while hunting or foraging. Cats, who have, of course, their kind of innate serial killer tendencies, I think are a polarizing case here. So cat lovers have this complicated trade-off between allowing their cats to roam freely, which is likely to lead to the deaths of a number of birds and other small animals. And in some cases, that has really serious consequences for biodiversity, like in Australia. And on the other hand, suppressing those instincts of cats and making them, well, bored. There have been suggested partial solutions to this, like having cats wear bells so that they're less effective killers, or giving them outdoor time in an enclosed environment, like a balcony that has netting all around, or just playing with them more and giving them lots of toys so that they're sufficiently stimulated without them having to put their considerable mental energy to killing as many animals. It's also been suggested that when cats are fed meat-dense diets, they tend to kill less. And beyond that, different dietary regimens have been proposed for other animals also as a way for them to get closer to their natural patterns, and also as a way to keep them more mentally engaged. So one strategy there is to vary the timing of meals to kind of keep the animals on their toes. Another is varying the location, such as by hiding some food as part of foraging programs for primates in captivity. Getting closer to foraging behavior, it can be pretty simple, like giving rhesus macaques peanuts in the shell rather than shelled peanuts. And indoors, it's been suggested that having food around on the floor allows rhesus macaques to forage a bit, and it reduces their boredom and aggression. Now, as with the timing of food, this kind of strategy, it shouldn't be so much that it makes it stressful for the animals. Another possibility is varying the type of food. With zebrafish, who are often used in lab research, feeding them live brine shrimp instead of flakes can improve their welfare. This is an image of a veined octopus eating a crab. And I want to read a pretty lengthy description, which is it's a vivid example of a live Dungeness crab fed to a giant Pacific octopus at the Seattle Aquarium. And that feeding activity occupied that octopus for a lot longer than a toy like a puzzle box would have, say. This is the quote on the slide. Once the crab was added to the tank, the octopus had to stalk the crab, pounce on it, and subdue it in its arms and web. Then the octopus drilled a hole in the crab shell using a radula or rasping tongue, in combination with a salivary papilla that exudes a dissolving agent. When the tiny hole was drilled, the octopus injected a venomous saliva that first paralyzed the crab and then killed it within minutes. The injected saliva also began the digestive process by loosening the muscle attachments. There is preliminary evidence that the octopus's saliva affects the crab flesh, making it easier to extract from their thin legs. All of the crab flesh was eaten. The carapace was removed from the body, and all the legs were dismembered and broken at the joints, presumably with the octopus's hard, horny beak, or pulled apart after loosening the ligaments holding them together by the injected saliva. Clean shell parts were then dropped or blown out of the den to form a midden. This process took more than 2 hours. And just in this paragraph, I, for one, have learned a lot about octopus behavior, like the fact that apparently they clean after eating. For something pretty different, this is an example of the enrichment activities mentioned by Brooklyn Zoo in New Zealand. They include things like hiding food strategically. And this zoo is actually asking the public to donate items like toys, ropes, and plastic buckets to enrich the lives of the zoo animals. Now, all of this raises other ethical questions. Does enrichment, by allowing an aquarium octopus to slowly kill and eat a live crab over the course of 2 hours, outweigh the quicker and possibly more humane methods of killing less intelligent animals for food? that's especially hard to answer because human understanding of octopus boredom is so limited. As for giving cats more meaty meals, well, keeping carnivores as pets is likely to result in more animal deaths overall because of all the pet food needed. Although there have been advances in cultivated meat, which is generated in bioreactors from animal cells. And in a few cases, that's being done specifically for pet food. This here on the slide is a photo of the lab at BioCraft, which is a company creating cellular versions of mouse meat, for instance, for pet food for cats. But overall, this idea of facilitating more deaths or slower deaths for the sake of relieving the boredom of more intelligent animals, that's a challenging question. Let's talk insects for a minute. A recent paper suggests that bees in a lab seem to roll around tiny wooden balls just for the sake of playing, which the researchers discovered entirely by accident. And one of the researchers on that study has said that paying more attention to the emotions of animals, such as their apparent interest in play, even when that's a surprise, it could have implications for insect welfare regulations, which essentially don't exist now. But it is increasingly important as insects become a more popular food choice in places where they're not a traditional food, both to feed humans and to feed animals. Another issue is that enrichment, if it's done poorly, can backfire. It might increase aggression, or it might get animals used to a level of stimulation that just can't be maintained. And more generally, and this is kind of a common concern in the animal welfare movement more broadly, one argument against all these kinds of enrichment projects is that they're just tinkering around the edges of a cruel system. They might make us feel a little bit better, but giving a zoo animal something to play with for a few minutes is just a tiny individualized measure compared to, say, abolishing zoos altogether. The other concern, I guess, here is that boredom often overlaps with other, arguably more serious concerns about animal well-being, like ill health and the ability to exercise natural behaviors. So there is an argument to be made, potentially, that talking about boredom risks trivializing those concerns. But given that confinement of animals for food, for research, and for other purposes isn't going to disappear anytime soon, I think that it's worth considering those animals' inner lives as well as their physical conditions, especially because often those two are really linked. As Lori Marino, a neuroscientist and co-founder and founder of the Whale Sanctuary Project, who's co-teaching a course here this summer, says, boredom is really stressful. It affects animals' immune systems and has a whole cascade of health effects. Obviously, it's better for the animals themselves to be psychologically healthier, but it's also better for the people who, for whatever reason, are keeping them captive or working in facilities where they're captive, like for conservation and eventual release into the wild, say. I mean, zookeepers, farmers, lab technicians, they all want mentally healthy animals. It adds to the stress of what can already be a very taxing job if animals are distressed. And boredom, I'm arguing, is one source of that distress. Okay, what about companion animals? Last year, another media fellow here, Kenny Torella, gave a hot topic talk about the case against pet ownership. His reporting suggests that a key reason that boredom can be so distressing for pets is that they often don't have ways to control it. It's that lack of ability to address the boredom, plus the boredom itself, that can be really disturbing in a pet cat, but also, in a pet orca, say. Not a pet orca, a captive orca. So I mentioned earlier the feather plucking of bored parrots. As one paper on pet bird states, parrots kept in cages are often deprived of companions, exercise, and overall complexity of experience, as well as foraging opportunities. I find that phrase, complexity of experience, really interesting. So this paper goes on to say that it's nearly impossible to provide enough intellectual stimulation to a caged bird. And a lot of animal behaviorists and people who live with pets, I think, would agree that pets can and often do seem to be bored. This is veering off in a slightly different direction, but if you'll bear with me. In a previous life, I did some research on children's rights. And something that surprised me was how often people would mention the right to play, that children have this fundamental right to play. And some of this language has started to creep into talk about certain pets as well. I mean, not that this is influencing laws necessarily or ending up in UN conventions, but there does seem to be increasing recognition that the responsibilities of the pet owner might extend to respecting the play and leisure of their pets. With dogs, those lines may not be so clear because dogs don't necessarily know the difference between work and play as long as they're not being overworked. And often dogs seem happier when they have tasks. So fetching sticks in a park and herding sheep on a pasture might both be very cognitively engaging for a dog. So allowing enough time for rest, leisure, and some measure of autonomy for a pet dog, along with a task that might be work, might be play. I mean, that seems to me like the recipe for a happy dog. It might seem like a provocative idea, but maybe some of the evolution that we've seen over the last century in children's rights might someday apply to animals' rights as well. And this is a real tangent, but the only country in the world that has not yet ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is the US. Okay. So there's now this common notion in children's rights that it's not enough just to protect children from harm and abuse. That's fundamental, that's elemental, but it's not enough. And various parties have a responsibility to pay attention to children's cognitive and developmental needs, for example, with the right to play. So when it comes to just the first part of that for animals, preventing harm and abuse, obviously we're a long way off from that in industrial animal agriculture, for instance. But I think that looking beyond negative rights, like freedom from violence and so on, and looking towards positive rights, such as the right to play and the right to express oneself, that could be a lodestar eventually for the animal protection movement. Of course, there are a lot of dangers from going too far in drawing analogies between animal rights and human rights. So I won't go too far down this path. The slide for something a bit happier, it shows a dog playground in the UK. And here's another example of play. In April, IKEA, in partnership with the Wood Green Pets charity, launched a line of cat and dog furniture explicitly for dogs and cats. And it directly mentions playing as one of the main four activities of those animals in the home. In a press release, IKEA stated, play not only stimulates your pet, it also creates a stronger bond. And you can see here an example from this new range, which is a soft bone-shaped toy for dogs. To me, that seems pretty harmless and potentially beneficial even. But I wouldn't want to contribute to a situation where the main ones profiting from discussion of animal boredom are companies seeking to profit off the anxiety of animal lovers in ways that aren't particularly backed by evidence. And there's no end to the ingenuity of businesses catering to pet lovers. This slide shows a few examples of the programs of dog TV, which are supposed to be designed to capture dogs' attention. And some people who live with dogs, they do report that their dogs seem to be engaging with this content. I mean, they might be like running towards a screen. They might be standing and watching it, for instance. I would argue, though, that that kind of research is more revealing about the perceptions of the dog owners rather than the dogs themselves. And that example might seem to epitomize the potential frivolity of talking about animal boredom, but I think there are a few key takeaways. For animals that are so intelligent and curious that boredom is likely adding significantly to their stress and confinement, whether that's lab primates, orca performers, pet parrots, or farmed pigs, I think there's a strong case that humans have an ethical responsibility to at least reduce that boredom. It's also often in people's financial self-interest to reduce that boredom because it so often has health effects. Now, decreasing that boredom, it requires space, time, attention to disease transmission, and some resources. And that has been a barrier to even, for instance, putting gravel and plants in the tanks of lab zebrafish. But it doesn't always need to cost the earth. A couple of weeks ago, I talked to Andy Shovel, who co-founded the plant-based protein company This, and also now is just now launching an animal charity called A Bit Weird. That name, A Bit Weird, gets at the disconnect between how different kinds of animals are treated, but they're trying to do it in this chatty, friendly way. So Andy believes that thinking about the cognitive needs of different animals, down to whether a pig needs toys, is actually a useful way of exploring that disconnect. He said, I absolutely think that it is helpful and will provide sort of cumulative effects. Because once people start thinking about how bored are they or aren't they, and once people start understanding more about how perhaps a pig needs the same sort of stimulation as a dog or a cat, which is true, obviously, it might just sort of bleed into other areas for them when it comes to animal ethics. And where animal species are being forced into continued boredom, mainly to relieve the boredom of humans, perhaps that's not a good enough reason to continue holding them captive. That is part of an argument for ending zoos and water theme parks dependent on animal performers, and there's precedent for that. Many countries have banned the use of wild animals in circuses, and some have gone further, extended that to all animals. Potentially, that could extend eventually into other legal structures, like the absence of enrichment being included within animal cruelty laws. Ultimately, talking about animal boredom may reveal more about human perceptions and behaviors than it does about other species. But I think that is useful if it helps to better understand the problem of reducing human boredom at the expense of animal suffering. In this talk, I've been speaking about animals in quite an abstract way, so I want to end on a slightly more personal note. My grandmother, shortly after she arrived in this country, she worked in a chicken factory. And it wasn't glamorous work and it wasn't pleasant work, but it was actually one of the happier times of her life because she was divorced and newly independent, and she could now have male friends. She didn't speculate about the inner lives of the chickens whose body parts she was separating. And maybe it's kind of remarkable that 2 generations later, I can do that kind of speculation. So my relationship with chickens is quite different to my grandmother's. These are the chickens who live in my parents' backyard. They're named Lucy and Ethel. And Lucy and Ethel are very old ladies now, but we wouldn't necessarily know that from seeing how active and how curious they are, and from seeing how much Lucy, who's on the right of this image, bullies Ethel, who's on the left. So Ethel and Lucy clearly have much better lives than almost every other chicken in America, including all of the chickens that eventually came to my grandmother for processing. My stepfather, meanwhile, has a very different relationship as well to birds. He has kind of a love-hate relationship with them. They poop all over the place, of course, and that extends sometimes to the patio. And he gets pretty frustrated. He's always saying, oh, they have the whole yard to poop in. Why do they have to go onto the patio? And every so often, he'll get so aggravated that he will shut them into their coop during the day. When they're locked up during the daytime, it's pretty clear, I think, to everybody that they're distressed. They're squawking, they're pacing around, and when they are let out, they're just rushing out in a jumble. Now, I can't know if part of what's making them stressed in that situation is boredom. But boredom is a useful kind of hanger, at least for me, to put some reflections about what their mental state might be and what responsibilities we humans might bear in relation to that. And to close, here are a few bits of further reading in case you want to read more about potential boredom in octopuses, ferrets, primates, fish, orcas, and more. Thank you so much for your time. I will just stop sharing here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Christine, for that interesting talk. So for those who are watching, we do have a few minutes to ask some questions of our speaker. And to do that, you can enter your questions in the chat or the comment space on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll get through as many as we can. And to kick things off, you spoke about companion animals and farmed animals and wildlife. Are there any particular areas where it strikes you that the issues of boredom are especially acute or extreme, where, if you have law and policy people here who automatically, our minds sort of go to interventions. So if you had to pick somewhere to start where things seem particularly bad, where would you start?
Well, unfortunately, I don't necessarily think that there's a straight line between the situations that are the most egregious, which would be, I think, for industrial animal agriculture, and the situations that we're more likely to see change anytime soon. A lot of the animal welfare laws just don't even apply to farmed animals. So it seems kind of unlikely, I think, that a lot of attention is going to be paid to enrichment outside of voluntary programs. Like I mentioned, organic and different supermarkets, retailers, and other companies might have their own programs for determining high welfare in farmed animals. And that often does include to enrichment claims, although there is a lot of humane washing when it comes to that sort of thing. So I think that consumers have to do a lot of research, unfortunately, because labeling standards are so inconsistent, as VLGS staff know very well. So moving apart from where boredom is the most acute, which I think would be in farmed animals, I think it's useful maybe to talk about the places where it could be alleviated a bit. And there, I think there's so much public momentum in the last decades around animal performance, and animals in zoos potentially. So circus animals, animals in theme parks. I mean, these are pretty charismatic animals to begin with. And there's been this wave of documentaries and other content about the very rich internal lives of these kinds of animals. So I think that there is space for campaigning there. And I'd be curious what legal scholars think about how understanding of these animals' specific neurobiology might help legal interventions.
Okay. So you talked in your presentation, you talked a little bit about in the companion animal space, some like advertising that IKEA and some other companies have done, kind of appealing to people's better nature, though with a commercial motivation. And in the environmental space, and particularly in the climate space, in the absence of regulation from the government, we see a lot of movement toward ESG practices in corporations. And in fact, some of the greatest leadership when it comes to climate change progress coming from the private sector. And so I wondered, is there an analog here, given, particularly you spoke about the absence of regulation protecting farmed animals in industrial agriculture? Is there more of a movement in the private sector that can help these animals? Is there that opportunity, or is it not really analogous to the climate space?
That's a really good question. And on ESG more generally, I have to admit that I have been proven wrong about that. I wrote this somewhat smug article a few years ago saying, oh, all of these political attacks on ESG, they're just hot air. They're not going to survive. Like there is a lot of corporate appetite and shareholder and consumer appetite for this kind of activity. And so these political attacks are just really weak. And, in the last couple of years, I have been proven wrong about that. So I would say that I don't necessarily have a lot of faith in the ability of corporations, even if they have the desire to withstand certain politicized attacks necessarily. And I think that ultimately, corporate actors that have the most scope to enact change in this, again, will be connected to industrial animal agriculture. If, a JBS, for instance, would commit to a certain amount of space and outdoor access for all of the animals in its supply chain, that would be transformative. I don't see it happening anytime soon. And when it comes to the IKEAs of the world, yeah, I mean, I don't see that there's much harm in selling a soft dog toy for a few dollars to dog lovers. I don't know if IKEA is now going to put that into its ESG reports, into its sustainability reports as something good that it's doing socially. If it were, I would be very skeptical of that. And I remain skeptical about corporate interest in this space in general, I would say.
Yeah, it makes me think about, we have these new Securities and Exchange Commission regulations on voluntary ESG reporting from corporations, where if corporations are going to be trying to benefit like commercially from advertising their ESG practices, that they have to have a certain level of transparency about what's behind that to avoid greenwashing. It would be really interesting to think about how animal welfare might be incorporated into that kind of reporting, and maybe that's a step down the road where environmentalists and animal advocates could join forces to push ESG reporting in that direction.
Absolutely. And just on that point about transparency, that's also a way to get a lot of folks in the room who aren't necessarily so concerned about animal welfare, but are concerned about their ability to have information about what they're eating. And at VLGS, Lori Feirenovan, for instance, she does a lot of work about how food labels are so hard to parse and they're so inconsistent. So I think that greater information, would be really useful.
Mm-hmm. You said a couple times that you see the likelihood of progress in the industrial agriculture space is really unlikely. Is that because of the kind of really overwhelming commitment to eating meat among consumers, that where there's that like lack of demand or pressure on that industry? Or could you just say more about where you see that coming from for folks that aren't in it every day?
Yes. And also, I mean, these movements we're seeing towards deregulation in industrial animal agriculture, although there are, of course, a lot of positive movements on the other side to, for instance, put a moratorium on concentrated animal feeding operations. But yes, there is still a really huge appetite for meat, for dairy, and for eggs. And even though this talk is kind of on animal welfare grounds, the main reason that people reduce their meat consumption isn't because of animal welfare. It's not because of environment. It's because of health. And it's hard to make an argument about animal boredom or animal needs that directly connects with health. Although there may be lawyers with very creative minds who can do that, and biologists as well, who can bring some of that evidence to bear. So, yeah, pragmatically, I think connecting some of these issues that we're seeing with industrial animal agriculture to people's concerns about health, I think would do a lot.
Yeah, you see that in the environmental space as well. That's the most compelling connection for a lot of people. Question from Professor Winders. As a reporter, what role do you think the media could play in helping with this, specifically relating to flagging the potential intersection of science and the law, and conveying the science to the public at large?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, there just isn't a lot of reporting really on, well, industrial animal agriculture, although I will stop beating that drum. Yeah, and a lot of the reporting that does exist on animals' scientific needs, on their interior states, for instance, it tends to focus on a few charismatic animals. And I mean, I'm somewhat guilty of this because my presentation talks a lot about orcas, for instance. But yeah, there are lots of fish, lots of birds, lots of other species that don't necessarily get the same amount of play from the media. And I think that taking an evidence-backed approach to reporting on that could be helpful. Although I do hear this from environmental scholars and also from people in the animal welfare space, that there's a real tension sometimes between like over relying on emotion and then using evidence as if those two things are incompatible, which I don't think they are. But sometimes I hear scholars arguing that journalists are doing too much of one at the expense of the other.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think that we will wrap up there and allow folks in our summer program to get to their next class. But thank you so much, Christine, for the interesting presentation. And thank you to everybody who joined us today for our first Hot Topics presentation of the summer. Our next talk will take place online on Thursday of this week. And for the most part, for the remainder of the summer, we'll be back on Tuesdays and Thursdays at noon. So we hope to see you joining us again. Have a good day, everyone.